Hi, this is Paul, and I'm not nearly as productive not on vacation as I am on vacation, apparently, because I've just been frustrated this week. I've been cleaning out my office, and you see this bookshelf. I got that. My daughter's cleaned out their room, and so I have this new bookshelf, and so I took down most of my books, and they're all in the sanctuary, and my sermon isn't done. I have council tonight, and my 98-year-old church member fell and hit his head, so I had to run across town, visit him in the home, and so I've just been running around and I haven't had time to do a video, and it's driving me crazy because I've got these ideas, I've got all these videos in my head, and I can't get them out, and it's making me nuts. And then along the way, Andy Walters makes a video to the Sam Harris Jordan Peterson debates and leaves a little note in my blog. And I'm just running around today crazy, thinking I don't have time for anything today. I don't have time for anything today. And I start listening to it. Oh man, I love this video that he made, and he told me, called me out kind of in a nice way at the end of it, because I'm a Christian. He wonders what kind of a fundamentalist Christian I am, which is a total fun thing to discuss. And so Andy doesn't have a big follower or anything. I don't know if this is just a one-off thing that he wants to do. He's got a great beard. Look at that beard. That is a nice beard. And Andy speaks well, and he's a clear thinker, and he's been watching his debates. But so I want to do a little commentary on his video because I thought he had a lot of good points. The sound seems a little low, so we'll see how this goes.
Hey everybody. I wanted to add my voice to the Jordan Peterson Sam Harris debate and see if we can untangle a few things. I've listened to, I think, a bit of the first one and the full length of the third one,
Shame on you for not hearing it all. We're going to take away your card from the Jordan Peterson fan club.
and I've also heard the most recent ones, and I've heard, I think, the first full podcast between Harris and Peterson. Um, and part of what's going on in this conversation that's difficult for me is I'm having trouble even figuring out what exactly are the claims that they're disagreeing about. It feels like to me, as somebody who has roots in analytic philosophy, that the claims aren't quite as precise as they could be. And I think that because there is some imprecision running around in the conversation, there is an opportunity to make that more precise and then really highlight the actual differences between Peterson and Harris.
And I have to tell you, Andy, I was listening to this in the car, and I'm looking all around for this fire truck,
Sorry, there's a siren going by.
and I got that a little late after I'm looking all around. Where's the fire truck? Where's the fire truck?
So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put together, I'm going to put forward 4 or 5 different claims that I think are being circled around but not named. And just by naming them, I'm hoping that that'll help kind of get us maybe unstuck in the way we're thinking about this conversation. And then I have some thoughts about how we might move the conversation forward in general. Um, so the first claim is this idea that there are principles of human flourishing. And I think that this really is at the bedrock of the conversation between Harris and Peterson, because it goes uncontested, certainly from Harris, or certainly from Peterson's side, and Peterson spends a lot of time talking about divine principles. Sometimes he uses that language, or he'll say wisdom, things like that. And I don't get the sense that Harris contests this basic idea that there are better and worse ways of being human. It's almost self-evidently true. Um,
Okay. Now, right away, when you said this, I thought, no, I can't blame people. He hasn't even seen all the Peterson Sam Harris. He hasn't even heard all the Peterson Sam Harris debates. Why would I expect him to have watched all of my videos? But if you look back at the video I did earlier this week, I referenced this tiny little book by a Canadian philosopher. I'm being facetious on the tiny little book, named Charles Taylor, and you might want to pick this up, because the point I was making from Charles Taylor's book is that this idea of the sources, principles for human flourishing, if you go to the chapter on providential deism, that's what it's about. Okay, providential deism was this intermediate step from the the period in European history, Charles Taylor says roughly around 1500, where belief in God is axiomatic. Everybody believes there's a God. Does that make everyone good? No. Does that make everyone a good Christian? No. Does that even make everyone a Christian? No. But everyone, almost everyone believes that there is a God, and believing in God is axiomatic. And what Taylor's book tries to answer the question, and Taylor knows a lot, which is evident through the book because it keeps telling us how much he knows, is he tries to get a handle on what exactly was the process within Christendom, within Western civilization, where Christianity, where belief in God goes from being axiomatic about the year 1500 to about the year 2000, where it's no longer axiomatic. And anyone who continues to believe in God is what has doubts, is what Charles Taylor calls cross-pressured. Now, both Peterson and Harris will say, yes, there are principles for living well. Now, and they agree on this. And while they do have maybe some disagreements about what those principles are, I think the debate between Peterson and Harris actually goes deeper, because Harris wants to say well-being is self-evident, and Peterson says not that self-evident. Peterson gets at this very strongly in the Dillahunty debates, because that's exactly where Peterson pounces on Dillahunty right from the start. That not only the idea that there are, Peterson doesn't really debate the idea that there are of principles of how to live a good life. He is right there in terms of, in some ways, perhaps a late stage providential deism, that there are principles. But what they're really going to start debating is the source of these principles. But Peterson is also going to be more skeptical, because he's going to tell Sam Harris that his assumptions about well-being are overly formed by Christianity. And Sam Harris will say, genetic fallacy. And Peterson is going to say, well-being is not as self-evident as you would imagine. And this is where we get into the question of happiness versus meaning, that people will often exchange meaning for happiness. So yes, sort of, but let's let Andy continue.
But that core set of principles, I think, is what the primary object of this debate has been about. Is
And again, I don't think it's so much if you could start to create a list of what those core sense of principles would be, there would probably be a fair amount of commonality between Peterson and Sam Harris, which is part of the reason they're both in the intellectual dark web. And there's a huge amount of agreement between them, which is part of what makes the debate interesting, because then the focus turns to, what are the source? How can we know the principles by which we can, in fact, construct a good life? That's the question. And Harris wants to say reason. And Peterson says, I'm not so sure about that. Your reason is a secondary thing. It stands upon presuppositions. As McGilchrist says, reason is a consistency tool, not a discovery tool necessarily. You have to have a fixed point upon which reason is built, but the fixed point is an assumption. It's a presupposition. And so one of the things that Peterson says more gently to Sam Harris, but probably because of status really bangs on Matt Dillahunty about, is well-being is not as self-evident as you imagine. And in fact, your assumptions about well-being have been constructed from the Christian framework and fabric. And they want to debate that. And Peterson is not going to concede that point, because Peterson looks around and says, well, let's look at evidence. Your assumptions of well-being fits quite well into a lot of the assumptions of other Christian people around you. And so when Matt Dillahunty deconverted from Christianity, as many people, as Andy mentions, he deconverted from Christianity. Many of them will say, I just stopped believing in God. You know, that's right, you just stopped believing in God. And you didn't go out and murder your neighbors or steal your neighbor's house or take your neighbor's car or start cheating your neighbors. No, in fact, you live quite well amongst all these other Christians. You don't live as well among people from other cultures, If we were to plop you in the middle of Africa, you'd have a whole lot more adjustment to do. If we plop you in the middle of Iran, you'd have a whole lot more adjustment to do. In other words, there's a huge degree of commonality built into your definition of well-being that you simply are not taking stock of. And Peterson is saying that those assumptions have a history. And I was just listening again to Dallas Willard's on the best of the, there's a podcast called The Best of the Veritas Forum, and in just some of the recent uploads, they republished an older talk by Dallas Willard on Nietzsche, and I think Willard really gets right down to it in terms of how Nietzsche formed the modern world, or at least how Nietzsche was right in calling the shape of the modern world so early. So back to Andy.
Is the nature of those principles. In particular,
See now, not really the nature, and a little bit later, I think he's going to nail it right. So
the content of those principles, the provenance of.
not so much the content. Again, the I think they'd find out they Sam Harrison and Jordan Peterson have a lot of agreement on the content of those principles, but the provenance of those principles, yes, that's what they're debating.
Those principles, the promulgation of those principles.
Yes, the promulgation of those principles, because Sam Harris wants to say, well, we can promote these principles via reason, and we'd best take all of this superstitious stuff and put this away. And Peterson is saying, if you go to the Occam, is it Occam, where he talks with Rubin is there, and then two other guys, and Peterson. I've mentioned that video before. Peterson basically is saying, the way we articulate these principles that is most natural to us and most like, let's say, machine code, all right? Because by the time you go to school and get educated and go into high school and college, you've got a capacity to work with abstract ideas and principles. When you get to principles, so you look at a story, you analyze the story, and you take the moral of the story. And what you do is you abstract out a moral. You take something which is contextualized within a story, you abstract out a moral, and then the idea is that you can plunk that down then into other contexts, and that will be useful. Now, deep within this project of what Peterson and Sam Harris are doing is the assumption that if we can abstract principles out of it, out of particular contexts, then we can apply those to other things. And now what you have to understand deep in our heart is the motivation, because the motivation here is to secure for ourselves well-being, to secure for ourselves the good life. And this is the goal. We would like to secure this for ourselves. And this is where, in a sense, you get into a fundamental conflict with at least my tradition of Christianity, which says this is something that human beings are not able to do. And this piece on Thomas Sowell that I referred to about I forget the language, but it was such a good piece. And this is what happens when I don't do a PowerPoint before I do a video, is that stuff comes up and I don't think it through. But are we in fact capable of constructing for ourselves the life we've always wanted? And Peterson is a skeptic on this. And this is what Peterson means when he says to Sam Harris, you're not taking the heavy hitters into account. You're not taking Nietzsche and Dostoevsky into an account. Now, someone just recently, I've been talking about a Russian movie. Now I can't remember. Oh, The Stalker, the Russian movie, The Stalker. That movie goes deeply into it because the question is, well, well-being. Well, how do you define well-being? Well, I define well-being according to what I want. Okay, but what do you really want? And the naive person thinks they know what they want. A worldly person keeps getting what they want and realize they want something else. They want something more. Donald Trump on his inauguration danced with his third wife, young, beautiful, won the presidential election, has all the money in the world, and the song that he danced to was Frank Sinatra, My Way. I did it my way. and this is Donald Trump well-being. Now, this is part of the problem with well-being. Whose well-being? Whose well-being at whose expense? And now Sam Harris would quite nicely and quite frankly in a Christian-y sort of way say, well, it should be well-being for everyone. That's how we will maximize well-being. Really? Does that happen in the world? Does that happen in a marriage? Even when you've just got two people that promise to love each other, that have chosen each other in our context, and they say what? Well, I'm in this marriage for my well-being, and the other person says, I'm in this marriage for my well-being. And the minute one of them says, this isn't working out for me, boom, you don't have a marriage anymore. People do that a couple times. They say, well, that doesn't really work. So it works a little bit better. And Sam Harris basically says this. It comes down to love. Well, love is a really tricky thing because love means being committed to the well-being of another. And while there are wonderful times when two people are young and healthy and have a fair amount of alignment in their life and they think, yeah, well-being, we're both looking for the same thing. Well, good for you. We'll be married. Why don't you be married a number of years? Or why don't one of you gets Alzheimer's or the other one has an affair or or your dream job comes up in another city and your other person has their dream job in a different city and now you're going to try commuting via airplane and I mean life is full of these kinds of things. Well-being is you have to be naive to imagine that well-being is something that's self-evident. And again, Dostoevsky goes into this, and if you read Dostoevsky, he goes down and down. Or read Tolstoy. Read Tolstoy's Confession. Tolstoy, he had everything he could ever want, but he could barely go into the barn alone because he was afraid he was going to off himself. Because what does it all matter? You know, once you get to the top of the top of the ladder, the top of the hierarchy, you say, is there a there there? So it's not so much the elements, the principles for living. If, in fact, and this is a point that I digress, and this is what happens when I don't go PowerPoint, Peterson wants to say, well-being is best articulated in stories, not in principles. Well, what do you mean by that? Well, a story, and give this back to this Occam talk that he did with Rubin and the two other guys, the objectivists, was that it? Peterson says there's something about us that we understand well-being via story far better than we understand it via a list of principles. And this, when you look at those two methods, you're really differentiating kind of a 19th century positivism that said we can distill and create a list of well-being. And what's interesting is that Harris kind of says, wow, yeah, we can create a list of well-being. And I would say, go ahead and try it. Just try and get to the depths of it. And this is the point that I've made in a number of other my videos. If I sit in the room and I try to describe this room, there is not a true infinite, but there is a near, it's true, I don't know. There's a near infinite number of things that I can describe. And because life is so rich and so large and so complex, story seems to be kind of the machine code that we have, and principles is kind of a higher, it's a different programming language that doesn't really connect up. There's no drivers and it doesn't really connect up to the hardware. And at the end of Andy's video, when he talks about Peterson and religion and music, because I'm probably gonna, oh gosh, what time is it? I'm probably gonna run out of time because I could probably talk for 2 hours just about this little video because there was so much good stuff in it and so much cool stuff and so much stuff it made me want to talk about. At the end of the video, Andy talks about music and how music is, Peterson is kind of like music and religion. I think that's a great point. I think he's really correct there. But let me continue because there's more good stuff. There's so much good stuff in this video. I really enjoyed it.
And so on. And so those are some of the particular claims that I want to cover next. So first, the content of these principles. So let me just pause here, actually, put a little kind of concrete around what I mean by these principles. So just to pull an example off the top of my head.
See, and this is part of the problem with even trying to use principles in order to pursue this objective. For example, via stories and via things, the Bible is full of this stuff. When the I'm preaching through the book of Second Kings, and when the commander of the army of the Syrians comes to Jerusalem to try to demoralize the people, and Hezekiah's figuring his goose is cooked, the commander of the Assyrian army says, open the gates and surrender, and all of you will be taken to a land that is rich with fruit trees, and you'll have your own houses, and it would be well watered. These are all short-term ways of communicating well-being, and he lived happily ever after. Um, we've developed all of this, and this is so much better than saying a principle, there needs to be sufficient water. There's no music to that. That doesn't work with people. Yeah, of course there needs to be sufficient water. We want there to be enough water, but not too much. The Bible talks about, the wise man at the beginning of the book of Psalms. The wise man is like a tree planted by a river that bears its fruit in season and out season. And the godless, those who don't follow the Lord and listen to his wisdom and obey his commands, they are like the chaff that gets blown by the wind. Talk about music. This is what humanity has been doing. And a little bit later in this video too, he'll talk about, but I think he's again right on that Peterson is using kind of a Darwinian evaluation of stories, and saying that these stories that last a long time are the ones that actually they work, and they work because they've been formed through history, and they just work. It's like the wheel.
Peterson is fond of talking about Abraham, the story of Abraham and Isaac, and the sacrifice that Abraham was called to make.
And again, a principle here would be, don't kill your son. Eh, Tell the story of Abraham and Isaac, and so much more is into that story.
And although I may not be getting all of the complexities correct here, the upshot for Peterson seems to be something like, the moral of this narrative is sacrifice now to get what matters later.
Okay, that's a perfect example of this. Well, you take a story, you turn wine into water, okay? And now you have a principle. Well, why? What's the value of this principle? Well, now you have this principle that you can apply to different situations. Here's the difficulty with principles. You have decontextualized it when you pulled it out of the story. How do you know if you know enough that it'll fit into another story? Let's say you're a black youth living in a crime-ridden part of town, and okay, well, save your money. Well, that doesn't make enough. Or let's use Somalia. Let's say you're living in a country where lords are reigning and there's so much chaos. Well, sacrifice now for the future. Peterson is dead on right. That mostly goes, and in fact, if you listen to my videos about Peterson and his Easter video in 5 parts, this issue about sacrifice is actually very foundational for Peterson in terms of his understanding about God. And my God number 1, God number 2 video God number 1, this God of the background, this God of the governing background. And because we saw that those who save flourish, those who share flourish, this gets built in, but then this gets articulated in stories. And this again is deeply part of Peterson's program, where he says it's through these stories that actually these principles get embodied and communicated with far greater effectiveness than sacrifice for today and tomorrow will be better. Well, maybe it will, maybe it won't, maybe you get hit by a car. So that's again an illustration between stories and principles.
Something along those lines. Now, that I would say that second part that I just said, sacrifice now to get what matters later, let's call that a fundamental principle of human flourishing. And then we have that principle is then enclosed, if that's a word.
See, and this is the problem with principles, because what you do with a principle is you decontextualize it, and you try and turn it into an elevated tool. And this tool nature is deep within the contradiction between Peterson and Harris. Peterson is far more suspect of tools, and Harris is, I think, far more naive about rationality as a tool and what it can accomplish. Peterson is far more hesitant, and I think again comes out of his work as a clinical psychologist, because you go into a room and you sit down with someone and someone tells you their problem and you diagnose them in your mind and say, okay, these are their problems. And so what I've learned in my education is these are these problems, and these are tools I can use to apply it to these problems. And so what you do as a psychologist or a pastor or a parent is I read this article about how to fix my child because they're wetting the bed. Okay, so you take this tool and you try to apply it. And what do you learn? Well, sometimes it works and you think, oh, great. Sometimes there are unintended consequences and you think, oh, I don't know if that tool was the right thing. More often you do something and it sort of makes some improvement. But what you then begin to realize is that this human being you're dealing with is enormously complex. And look at antibiotics. Well, infections are a problem. We develop antibiotics. Antibiotics kills infections. Great. Well, time, 70 years into it. Well, what do we discover? Well, the germs are fighting back. So we develop new antibiotics. Oh, and we're using antibiotics to feed to farm animals. And well, what are the unintended consequences of that? And we're overprescribing antibiotics for certain kinds of things. And what are the unintended consequences of that? Peterson keeps saying basically the world is far more complex. And so the best orientation we have for trying to understand the world is looking in the past. And you might say, okay, but scientifically, how far can we look back? Not very far. Not very far at all. Depending on which field, maybe only 50 years or 100 years or 150 years, or maybe 300 or 400 years when it comes to certain elements of chemistry or physics. Then you're dealing with Newtonian. Beyond that, you don't have anything. So Peterson says, how can we appropriate the wisdom? How can we appropriate the evidence that we have gained over the last 100 million years or 3.5 billion years while we've been watching each other? And how has that been encoded? That has been encoded in the Bible, and that's been encoded in other stories. Now we're going to get to that because Andy makes a good point on that later on. And again, I'm going to keep interrupting this video, and I'm not going to get through the whole thing. So go ahead to Andy's page and listen to his video because I thought it was worth listening to.
Clothed in this particular narrative of Abraham and Isaac. So that's what I mean by those principles. So then now let's turn to different questions. So those principles exist, and then now if we ask ourselves, what is the content of those principles? I think that Peterson has spent really much of his life trying to assemble a list of these principles.
Yes.
Now that may be
Peterson, because he's a clinical psychologist, has been working from this paradigm for a long time, and he sees its limitations.
Doing a slight disservice to Peterson because I think that it's not just an objective list of like 18,000 principles that are all on a surface level and not connected at a deeper level.
Right.
But I do think, nevertheless, it seems to me that this seems to be Peterson's main program is what are the principles of living?
Yes, 12 rules for life.
That enable human flourishing. And in this, of course.
But again, don't forget, Peterson has more skepticism that this business about enabling human flourishing, discovering human flourishing, living out a flourished life is attainable because he reads Dostoevsky.
This fact makes total sense when you consider that Peterson is a clinical psychologist. He spent many years, I assume, helping people to get unstuck in their lives. And certainly what he's doing is helping people get unstuck in their lives now on a much broader scale. And I would include myself in that category. So that seems to be the kind of thing that Peterson is up to. So Harris, on the other hand, he has spent a lot of his life his career, I should say anyway. He was made famous for debunking, not debunking, but really attacking fundamentalism, and I think if I was to, in broad strokes, kind of paint their natural conversational style, I would paint Peterson as like a reclaimer, and I would paint Harris as like a debunker.
And I think that's a really helpful categorization. I think that I think those two labels really get them well. That Peterson is a reclaimer. That's now he's a liberal. He's not a right winger. And again, Andrew Sweeney and Rebel Wisdom, I think, are engaging in some of this conversation well. But he's a reclaimer, and Harris is a debunker. And bingo.
And Harris, debunks um, a lot of the fundamentalist myths. I get even confused saying debunks the myth because now I'm so far from fundamentalism that they don't even seem like they need to be debunked anymore.
And we are all contextualized when we watch these things.
But certainly there was a time in my life where they did need to be debunked, and that's what he primarily is. And he identifies with that skeptic crowd, the James Randys of the world. Although he has important differences with them, I don't want to paint him into a corner there. But I do think that's, broadly speaking, a kind of a fair assumption. So when we're looking at this conversation, then it's no surprise that Peterson is interested in motivating people and reclaiming this religious tradition, specifically Christianity, whereas Harris is more interested in debunking any problems associated with doing that. And so that's a kind of painting the picture, or setting the basis here. So when we ask ourselves, what's the content of these principles? Peterson is going to say, yeah, there's this list of principles I came up with, and there's actually a strong overlap between that list and Christianity itself.
Right. And that's exactly what I'll say to Harris.
And Harris is going to want to say, or does say, well, there may be this objective set of principles at the core, but at the same time, those principles have been clothed in the language of Eastern mythology. In fact, Harris would say,
And I think he's dead on right. This is what Harris wants to say. And this, I think, exposes Harris has an issue with Christianity. Okay, everybody has issues. You can have issues with Christianity. That's all right. I understand that. But this is Peterson wants to say you've got issues with this, and this is why the debate is not so much the content of these principles, but the source of these principles, and that gets exposed when Harris says, "Well, I can get these principles from the East."
it's been clothed better in some Eastern traditions in their mythology than in Christianity. And so one of the claims that I want to put forward here is this notion of what I'm calling mythological fungibility. And the idea here is that one could, or the claim, somebody who subscribes to mythological fungibility would buy the notion that that objective set of principles could be expressed equally as well in any tradition.
And I don't think Peterson, because they had this part of the debate, and Andy didn't list all the debate, but Sam Harris made this point to Peterson. Peterson's, well, I take some stuff from Taoism, and I talked about some other, I talked about some other cultures and some other mythologies, but I know the Western mythology is better, so that's really what I work from. But I don't know that Peterson would deny that you can derive wisdom from mythologies from the East and other cultures. In fact, even a Christian like Peter Kreeft, who is a conservative Catholic and a Dutch friend told me that Kreeft means lobster in Dutch, which was really cool. But even Peter Kreeft won't deny that you can learn wisdom from the East.
Assuming that the necessary, you know, uh, human artistic tendencies were applied to that tradition. And so here we might think of, you know, not only the Eastern traditions, but also, you know, the story of Pinocchio, which of course doesn't originate in a religious tradition at all, or the story of
Right. And so Peterson uses Pinocchio. He uses the Lion King. And this is part of Peterson saying that there are archetypal truths that they can be, you can find them in the Bible, you can find them in Disney, you can find them in mythologies all over the world. I don't think Peterson would contest this point at all.
Beauty and the Beast or Grimm Brothers fairy tales. And what's curious is that I think Jordan Peterson actually subscribes to mythological fungibility, but Harris is using mythological fungibility as a way of casting doubt on the notion that there's something really embedded in the Christian tradition that can't be found elsewhere. And so
Now, what's interesting is that if you go to, well, maybe I'll pause and go there. 'Cause I can do that. This is from C.S. Lewis, The Grand Miracle, one of my favorite pieces from C.S.
Grand
Lewis.
Miracle
You
by
can,
C.S.
oh, you
Lewis.
can tell the sound level difference. I'm not going to fix it. I never read it.
One is very often asked at present whether we could not have a Christianity stripped, or, as people who ask it say, freed from its miraculous elements. A Christianity with the miraculous elements suppressed. And now it seems to me that precisely the one religion in the world, or at least the only one I know, with which you could not do that is Christianity. In a religion like Buddhism, if you took away the miracles attributed to Gautama Buddha in some very late sources, there would be no loss. In fact, the religion would get on very much better without them, because in that case the miracles largely contradict the teaching. Or even, in the case of a religion like Mohammedanism, nothing essential would be altered if you took away the miracles. You could have a great prophet preaching his dogmas without bringing in any miracles. They are only in the nature of a digression, or illuminated capitals. But you cannot possibly do that with Christianity, because the Christian story is precisely the story of one grand miracle. The Christian assertion being that what is beyond all space and time, what is uncreated, eternal, came into nature, into human nature, descended into his own universe, and rose again, bringing nature up with him. It is precisely one great miracle. If you take that away, there is nothing specifically Christian left. There may be many admirable human things which Christianity shares with all other systems in the world, but there would be nothing specifically Christian. Conversely, once you have accepted that, then you will see that all other well-established Christian miracles are part of it, that they all either prepare for, or exhibit, or result from the Incarnation. And just as every natural event exhibits the total character of the natural universe at a particular point and space of time, so every miracle exhibits the character of the Incarnation. And now, if one asks whether that central grand miracle in Christianity is itself probable or improbable, of course, quite clearly,
And you can read The Grand Miracle in Lewis's book, Miracles. So this again is the point. And so Harris is perceptive in noting, well, Christianity is a little different here. And so Peterson, if you stick to all of the stuff common to the other mythologies, I won't have a problem. But when you go into Christianity and you don't what? You don't what? You don't take off the top. Okay, you like to come up from the bottom, and maybe stuff have come up from the bottom. It gets expressed in other religions and other mythologies, and maybe even in the Bible. And you can hear Brett Weinstein on the Joe Rogan show when Brett and Jordan Peterson were on Joe Rogan, and they debated these points. In that video, this is where this gets debated, because Brett Weinstein will say, well, maybe there is some wisdom in there, but it's up to us to choose. But this leads to the difficulty, because on what basis do you choose? Well, I have to leverage that wisdom and what? Well-being. This then shows the circularity of it, because we evaluate well-being based on what? Well, based on our experience. Well, why have we said we need to look at need to look at many more human beings, not just me, but we also need to look at human beings going back in time. Well, how far back in time? Well, as far as we can go. Well, scientifically, we've been doing psychological studies for 50, 60 years. Oh, and most of them to Western civilization. Well, that doesn't tell us much. So we have to get broader. So we have to do these in other situations, other civilizations. But we're already late in the game there, so that's not really helping us much. So it would be good if you actually had a system that had at least some control element, like a standardized religious text, and you had a fairly well documented history of communities around this text and their conversations around this text, and then suddenly you're into Islam, a little bit longer, Judaism, a little bit longer, Christianity. And I'm not saying that there aren't similar things in Hinduism or in Buddhism, but this is the point. If you're going to judge well-being, you want as far back a sense of it as you can. And in that sense, Peterson's Darwinian question and his pragmatic Darwinian element of truth, that's why that comes into the picture. You see, Peterson has been working through his stuff for a long time, and good, bad, right, or wrong, he's got a fair amount of consistency in this level of it. Now you get into more of the social conversation and the political conversation, I think it gets more complex, but when you look at this part of his mission and this layer of his work, this is where this goes. Now I wish I had more time to keep going through this video because, you know, a little bit later, we'll see if I get lucky.
Harris's notion here,
See, the sound level's low.
To enable something like a human god to interact with mankind, or is Peterson?
Anyway, so this is terribly quick and dirty because I don't have any time to do a video today, but I can't help but do one because I get frustrated and annoyed if I can't make a video. So here's a video, and listen to Andy's video and leave him a comment. And if you want to hear more of his videos, subscribe. I don't know if he'll do any more. I mean, there are very few people that are as OCD on Jordan Peterson as myself, as you've noticed. But it's kind of an addictive thing, as many of you can testify to. So yeah, there's some comment. But great video, Andy. I wish I had more time to go through the whole thing. Maybe you and I can do a talk or something, and then the sound will be better, and we can talk about some of these things because you're wondering how fundamentalist I am. And the answer with that would probably be more fundamentalist than you want me to be, because, and others have asked, well, define fundamentalist. It's a terribly fraught word to use because sometimes the best definition of it is someone who is to something than you think they should be. So there it is.